The wire transfer confirmation was still open on the shared laptop when I sat down to pay the electric bill. $340,000 gone from our joint account 3 days earlier, routed to an account I'd never seen a statement for in 12 years of marriage. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there with the cursor, blinking over a number that used to be my father's, then mine, then ours, and now apparently someone else's. The kitchen was quiet in the particular way a house gets quiet when everyone in it is asleep, except you. I remember thinking absurdly that I should close the laptop before I read anything else. I didn't. My name is Michael. I'm 44, I design bridges and drainage systems for the county, and I'd been married to Rachel for 12 years by the time I found that transfer. We had a daughter, Lily, 9 years old, sharp as a tack and already better at math than either of us. We had a house on a quiet street in Boise that my father's inheritance had paid off in full. And we had, until that night, a marriage I would have described, if you'd asked me that morning, as solid. Not perfect, solid. That's the word men like me reach for when we haven't looked closely enough to know better. I want to tell you something before I go any further, because I think it matters for understanding everything that comes after. I am not by nature a suspicious man. If anything, I've spent most of my life erring the other direction, trusting too easily, asking too little, telling myself that a good marriage runs on faith rather than surveillance. When my father died 6 years ago and left me just under $500,000, I put almost all of it into a joint account within a month, because that's what you do when you trust someone completely. I didn't check that account more than a handful of times a year after that. Rachel handled the finances. She was good at it, better than me, and it had always felt like one more way our marriage worked efficiently, one more chore neatly divided. That night, I hadn't gone looking for anything. I want to be honest about that too. I'd sat down to pay the electric bill because the login was saved on the shared laptop and mine wasn't working on my phone, and the browser had auto-filled straight into a page I wasn't supposed to be looking at. A secondary account, one I didn't recognize, linked to our primary through some administrative thread I still don't fully understand. $340,000. Gone in a single transfer, dated 3 days earlier, routed to something called Meridian Capital Partners, LLC. I sat with that for a while before I did anything else. If you've ever found something you weren't looking for, something that rearranges a fact you'd built your whole life around, you know that particular kind of stillness. It isn't panic yet. It's closer to standing at the edge of a pool before you know how cold the water is. I didn't wake Rachel up that night. I want to explain why, because I think the reason says something true about who I was before all of this and who I had to become. I've spent most of my adult life avoiding confrontation the way other men avoid the dentist, not because I don't understand its necessity, but because some old, stubborn part of me believes that if I just wait long enough, the problem will resolve itself without requiring me to say anything uncomfortable out loud. It served me poorly more than once. It served me poorly that night too, though not in the way you might expect. I didn't wake her up and demand an explanation. I closed the laptop, went upstairs, and lay next to her in the dark for 3 hours, listening to her breathe, running the number over and over in my head like a stone I couldn't stop turning. $340,000. Meridian Capital Partners. A name I'd never heard her say, not once in 12 years. The next morning she made coffee, kissed Lily's head on the way out the door for school drop-off, asked me if I'd remembered to call about the gutters. Ordinary. Entirely, devastatingly ordinary. I remember watching her from the kitchen table, this woman I'd built a life with, wondering how many other ordinary mornings had been sitting on top of something I didn't know about, And I made a decision that morning that I'm still not sure, even now, was the right one. I decided not to ask her yet. I told myself I needed more information before I said anything, that if I confronted her with half a fact, she'd have every advantage in explaining it away, and I'd be left holding nothing but her version of events. Some part of that reasoning was true. Another part of it, I understand now, was just my old habit wearing a more respectable disguise. Either way, I made coffee, went to work, sat through a meeting about a culvert redesign I couldn't have summarized 5 minutes later, and spent the entire day turning one name over in my mind. Meridian Capital Partners. I looked it up that night, after Rachel had gone to bed. It took less than 10 minutes to find the state business registry, less than 10 minutes to find the two names listed as founding partners, Rachel Bennett and a man named Trevor Michaels, a name I recognized vaguely as someone Rachel had mentioned once or twice over the past year, always in the same breath as networking event or investor dinner, always framed as nothing more than a professional connection in her growing real estate side business. I sat at my desk that night with that registry page open, and something in me went very quiet. Not calm exactly, but still, in the way water goes, still right before it's about to do something you didn't ask it to do. I didn't know it yet, but that transfer wasn't the only thing Rachel had been keeping from me for the better part of a year. And the account wasn't even close to the most painful thing I was going to find once I started looking. For the first week after I found the transfer, I did nothing that would have looked from the outside like a man whose life had just cracked open. I went to work. I picked Lily up from her Tuesday piano lesson and listened to her practice the same 8 bars of a Clementi sonata until they finally sat right under her fingers. I mowed the lawn on Saturday, same as always, and Rachel brought me a glass of lemonade halfway through. Same as always, and I thanked her, same as always, while some part of me stood a few feet back from my own body, watching the whole domestic scene like it belonged to someone else. I didn't ask her about Meridian, not because I'd stopped wanting to know, because I understood, somewhere underneath the wanting, that once I asked, I couldn't unask it, and some part of me wasn't ready to lose the version of my marriage I still had, even for one more week. Our house ran on a rhythm we'd built together over 12 years, and money had always been the one area where that rhythm belonged almost entirely to Rachel. I designed drainage systems for the county. She managed our finances, our investments, the modest real estate portfolio she'd built up over the past 4 years, buying and flipping 2 small rental properties near Boise State. I signed things when she put them in front of me. I trusted the numbers because I trusted her, and for a long time, that had felt like a reasonable division of labor, rather than what I now understand it actually was. A door I'd left unlocked for over a decade without ever checking who might be walking through it. Rachel's real estate side business had started small. One duplex, bought with a modest loan, fixed up on weekends, sold at a decent profit. That had been 3 years ago. Somewhere in the past year, it had grown into something more formal, something with a name and a partner and apparently a bank account I'd never seen. She talked about it at dinner sometimes, a property under contract, a zoning issue, a buyer who'd backed out. And I'd nodded along the way. You nod along to a hobby of your spouse's that you don't fully understand, but are glad makes them happy. I never asked to see the books. It never occurred to me that I should have to ask. I started noticing things that week I hadn't let myself notice before. Not new things, I understood later, just things I'd been filing away without examining. She took calls on the back porch now, door closed, even in the cold. She'd started doing that maybe 8 months earlier, and I'd assumed it was about client confidentiality, the ordinary discretion of someone building a business. Watching her through the kitchen window that week, phone pressed to her ear, pacing the length of the porch with her free arm wrapped around herself, I noticed for the first time how her shoulders came up around her ears during those calls, how she'd come back inside afterward with a bright, slightly too quick smile, like she was resetting her face before she opened the door. Looking back now, that porch had been telling me something for months. I just hadn't been listening. Trevor Michaels came up again on Thursday in a way that felt almost too easy, like the universe handing me a thread I hadn't asked for. Rachel mentioned she had an investor dinner that evening, said it the way she always said it, casual and half distracted while she picked out earrings in the bathroom mirror. I asked, as neutrally as I could manage, who else would be there. Trevor, a couple of his contacts. It's boring, Michael, believe me. She said it lightly, clipping the second earring in, not meeting my eyes in the mirror for a beat longer than felt natural. You'd hate it? You mention him a lot, I said. Trevor. She paused, just barely, just long enough that I caught it. A half-second hitch before she reached for her perfume. He's my business partner. Of course I mention him. A short laugh, a little too quick. Why, are you jealous of my 42-year-old business partner with the golf tan? I laughed too, because that's what the moment seemed to require. And I told her I was joking, and she kissed my cheek on her way out the door, smelling like the perfume she usually saved for anniversaries. I smiled and let it go, the way I'd let 100 small things go over 12 years, telling myself that a good marriage runs on trust rather than surveillance. I understand now that trust and inattention aren't the same thing, even though for a long time I'd let myself believe they were. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever caught someone you love in the smallest possible hesitation, half a second, nothing you could point to, nothing you could ever repeat back to them as proof of anything, you know how that feels. It doesn't announce itself as danger. It just sits in your chest afterward, small and cold, refusing to leave. Lily was the one who handed me the next piece, though she had no idea she was doing it. She came home from a playdate at her friend Emma's house that Friday and mentioned entirely offhand that Emma's mum had said something about your mum's new office downtown, how nice it looked, how she'd seen Rachel there when she'd dropped off some paperwork for the neighborhood HOA. I hadn't known Rachel had an office downtown. As far as I understood things, her business ran out of a home desk and the occasional coffee shop meeting. I didn't ask Rachel about it that night. I filed it away with the porch calls and the hesitation over Trevor's name and the $340,000 sitting in an account under a company name I'd only just learned to spell. And I started quietly, methodically, the way I approach a stress calculation on a bridge deck I don't yet trust, to build a file. I didn't call it that yet, not even to myself. I told myself I was just being careful. But I bought a small notebook that weekend, the kind you'd use for grocery lists, and I started writing down dates, the porch calls, the investor dinners, small inconsistencies between what Rachel said about the business and what I was starting to notice didn't quite add up. I didn't know it yet, but that notebook was going to fill up faster than I expected, and the office downtown wasn't going to be the strangest thing I learned about that week. That distinction belonged to something I found 4 days later, tucked inside a filing cabinet I'd walked past 1,000 times without ever once opening. The filing cabinet lived in the corner of what we called the office, really just a converted spare room off the garage, where Rachel kept her business paperwork and I kept old blueprints I never looked at anymore. I'd walked past that cabinet for 3 years without a single reason to open it. That Tuesday, with Rachel out showing a rental to prospective tenants, I had one. Most of what I found was ordinary. Closing documents, property tax records, the kind of dry administrative paper trail that comes with owning rental units. But near the back of the second drawer, behind a stack of old lease agreements, I found a folder labeled MCP, Personal, and inside it, printed bank statements for an account I now recognized by name, Meridian Capital Partners. The transfer I'd found on the laptop wasn't the only one. There were 4 more before it, going back 11 months, smaller amounts, $15,000 here, $22,000 there, money moved out of accounts I'd thought were ours and into one that, according to the registry, belonged half to my wife and half to a man I'd met exactly twice at holiday parties. I remember standing there in that little office with the statements in my hand, feeling something tighten low in my chest. Not quite anger yet, something closer to vertigo, the sense of a flaw you'd trusted for years, quietly admitting it had never been solid. I photographed every page with my phone before putting the folder back exactly where I'd found it. Corners aligned the way they'd been, drawer closed with the same soft click. I'd become good, in the space of 2 weeks, at leaving things undisturbed. She told me, much later, what was happening on her end around that same time. I didn't plan for it to become what it became. That's the part I need him to understand, even though I know understanding isn't the same as forgiving. It started as a business decision. Trevor had capital connections I didn't, and folding some of our joint savings into Meridian meant faster growth than I could manage flipping one duplex at a time. I told myself I was protecting our future, building something Michael would thank me for eventually. Once I could show him the returns instead of the risk. I didn't tell him because I knew exactly what he'd say, that it was too much, too fast, that we should talk to someone first. I didn't want to be talked out of it. I'd spent my whole childhood watching my mother count grocery money at a kitchen table, and some part of me had decided a long time ago that I would never again be a woman who had to ask someone else's permission to feel safe. I told myself that justified almost anything. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. Not that week, standing in the office with the folder back in its drawer like nothing had happened. The notebook filled up faster than I expected. I started noticing the small tells that had probably been there for months, once I knew to look for them. Rachel angled her laptop screen away from me now when I walked into a room, a habit she hadn't had a year ago. She'd started keeping her phone face down on every surface, even the kitchen counter, where it had always just sat, screen up, unremarkable. When it buzzed during dinner one night, she didn't glance at it the way she used to. She reached for it fast, almost reflexively, and turned it over before I could see more than the first word of a name on the lock screen. I caught 2 letters. I didn't say anything. I ate my dinner and asked Lily about her spelling test. Some of you already know this particular kind of quiet, the one where you keep gathering pieces instead of asking the one question that would give you all of them at once. Not because you're slow to understand, but because some part of you isn't ready yet to stop being the man who didn't know. I went to the downtown office Lily had mentioned on a Wednesday afternoon, telling myself I was just curious, telling myself I had every right to see where my wife worked. The building was a converted warehouse space near the river, nicer than I expected. Meridian Capital Partners stenciled in clean lettering on frosted glass beside a name I hadn't expected to see paired with hers on a physical door. Trevor Michaels, managing partner. I stood in the parking lot for 10 minutes without going in. Through the window, I could see them at a shared desk, heads bent over the same laptop. Rachel laughing at something he'd said, her hand briefly resting on his forearm in a way that felt too easy, too practiced, the kind of gesture that only happens between people who've stopped noticing they're doing it. I drove home before either of them looked up. I told myself, on the drive, that a hand on a forearm wasn't proof of anything specific. And that was true. Technically, in the narrow, lawyerly way, facts are sometimes true while missing the entire point of what they mean. The second red flag that mattered came from Emma's mother, of all people, 10 days later, at a school fundraiser I'd almost skipped. "You two are handling the Meridian thing so well," she said, refilling her wine, entirely unaware she was handing me something. "Rachel told me you'd both agreed it made sense to keep the accounts separate for tax reasons. Smart, honestly. My husband and I never think that far ahead." I said something non-committal and excused myself to find Lily. I stood by the gymnasium doors for a long moment, turning that sentence over. We'd both agreed. We hadn't agreed on anything. I hadn't known Meridian existed until a browser auto-filled a page I wasn't supposed to see. Rachel wasn't just hiding money from me. She was constructing, in real time, a version of our marriage where I was a willing participant in a decision I'd never once been part of, telling other people a story about us that didn't include me at all. That was the moment something in me finally stopped being confused and started being certain. I didn't need more evidence to know what I already knew. I needed evidence for what I was going to do about it. I drove home that night and sat in the driveway for a while before going inside, watching the kitchen light through the window, Rachel's shape moving back and forth as she made dinner, unaware that the man about to walk through the door wasn't the same one who'd left that morning. I didn't confront her that night either. I told myself I still needed more. Bank records, a clearer picture of exactly how much had moved and where. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that once I said the words out loud, there would be no version of my marriage left to go back to, even for one more quiet dinner. And some part of me, the same part that had avoided hard conversations for 12 years, wanted one more ordinary night before I gave that up for good. I didn't know it yet, but I wasn't going to get many more of those. The next piece of evidence I found wasn't going to come from a filing cabinet or a parking lot. It was going to come from Rachel herself, in a mistake so small she probably never even noticed she'd made it. And it was going to hand me everything I needed to finish what I'd started. The mistake, when it came, was almost insultingly small. Rachel left her laptop open on the kitchen island one Sunday morning while she ran out to grab Lily from a sleepover, trusting, correctly for 12 years, that I'd never once gone looking through her files. Her email was still logged in. I told myself I wasn't going to look. I looked anyway, and near the top of her inbox was a message from Trevor with a subject line that didn't need any context to understand. Keeping this from Michael a little longer. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to an email account I'd created that week for exactly this purpose. Quietly, deliberately, the same way I'd been photographing statements and writing dates in a grocery notebook for 3 weeks running. I remember how still my hands were doing it. Not shaking, steady, in a way that frightened me a little, because I understood I'd already become someone capable of this. Closing a laptop, wiping a search history, walking back outside to finish watering the tomatoes before she got home. The email confirmed what the folder and the parking lot and Emma's mother had already told me in pieces. Meridian wasn't a modest side investment. Rachel and Trevor had used almost the entirety of my father's inheritance, the money I'd trusted her to manage, the money that had paid off our house, to leverage 2 commercial property acquisitions, both under Meridian's name, both structured so that if the deals succeeded, the gains would flow through the LLC rather than back into our joint accounts. If they failed, the losses would land, eventually, on the same joint accounts they'd been drawn from. She'd built herself an exit either way, win, and she'd have independent wealth Trevor helped her hide from me, lose, and I'd be the one who absorbed it, never having known I was exposed at all. Looking back, I understand now what that structure actually was. It wasn't a business decision that happened to leave me out. It was designed to leave me out. Those are different things, and it took me longer than it should have to see which one I was living inside of. I hired an attorney the following week, not to file anything yet, just to understand what I was looking at and what my options were once I decided to act. Her name was Denise Halloran, and she was blunt in a way I found strangely comforting after a month of careful, quiet lying. "This inheritance," she said, flipping through the printed statements I'd brought her, "was it commingled or kept separate originally?" "Commingled." I put it straight into our joint account. That complicates things, but it doesn't erase them, especially given what you're describing here. If she used marital funds without your knowledge or consent to capitalize a business you weren't informed of, that's relevant regardless of how the account started. Document everything. Don't confront her yet. The moment you do, anything not already secured becomes something she can move, hide, or spend. I left her office with a list of things to gather: property deeds, tax filings, the full history of transfers, and a new, uncomfortable understanding of the man I was becoming. 12 years of avoiding hard conversations had turned, almost overnight, into a capacity for patience I hadn't known I had. I wasn't proud of it. I wasn't ashamed of it either. I was just aware, in a way I hadn't been before, that some part of me had finally decided to stop being the last person in my own life to find things out. You already sense where this is going. I did too, by then, just not yet how far it was going to reach. The subplot with Emma's mother closed its loop that same week, in a way I hadn't anticipated. She called Rachel, I learned this only later, to ask, with entirely innocent curiosity, whether we'd found a tenant yet for the second duplex, since she'd mentioned to a friend that we might be renting it. Rachel apparently went quiet on the phone for a long moment before changing the subject, and Emma's mother, sharper than her wine-refilling small talk suggested, mentioned it to Rachel a little too casually the next time they spoke. "You seemed weird when I brought up the duplex. Everything okay with you two?" Rachel told her everything was fine, but I noticed that week a new tightness in her that hadn't been there before, a missed step in her usual composure, a night she went to bed early without explanation, a morning she stood at the kitchen window for a long time before she noticed I was watching her. She told me much later that this was the week the fear finally caught up with the plan. She said she'd started to feel for the first time like the version of herself she'd built, capable, independent, finally safe, was standing on ground that could give way at any moment, and she didn't yet know whether that ground was Trevor or me or something inside herself she'd been avoiding since she was a girl at her mother's kitchen table. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. I finished building my file that Thursday night. Bank statements, the forwarded email, photographs of the folder in the office, a printed record of the business registry, and Denise's notes on what could and couldn't be recovered, depending on how I chose to proceed. I sat at my desk, with all of it laid out in front of me, a life's worth of quiet trust reduced to a stack of paper, and I understood that I had exactly one decision left to make. When? I chose the following Saturday, after Lily left for a weekend at my sister's. I told myself it was strategy, that I wanted privacy, wanted no small ears anywhere near what was coming. That was true. It was also true that some part of me needed 3 more days to prepare myself for the version of my life waiting on the other side of that conversation, because once I said what I knew, there was no folder I could close and put back exactly where I'd found it. I didn't know it yet, sitting at that desk on Thursday night, that Rachel was going to hand me one final piece of the truth before I'd even asked the first question, and that it wasn't going to come from anything I'd found. It was going to come from something she couldn't stop herself from saying the moment she understood, finally, that the version of her she'd been protecting for a year was already gone. Saturday came grey and quiet. The house unusually still, with Lily gone. Rachel came downstairs around 10, poured coffee, asked if I wanted to look at rental listings with her for the second duplex. I set the folder on the kitchen table instead. She looked at it for a long moment before she looked at me. "What is that?" "Everything, Rachel." I kept my voice level. I'd practiced this in my head for 3 days, and some cold, steady part of me held the line even as my pulse hammered in my ears. Meridian's bank statements. The 5 transfers going back 11 months. The property acquisitions under the LLC. Trevor's email about keeping this from me a little longer. I laid my hand flat on the folder. Didn't open it yet. "I know exactly how much of my father's money you moved, and exactly when you moved it. It's not what you think." The words came fast, automatic. "The properties are appreciating, Michael, if you just let me explain the numbers. I don't want the numbers. I want to know why I've been married for 12 years to someone who built an entire structure specifically so that if it failed, I'd be the one who paid for it. And if it worked, I'd never even know I'd been cut out. That's not fair. I was going to tell you once." "Once what?" "Once it worked. You told Emma's mother we'd agreed on this together. You told her a version of our marriage where I knew, Rachel. You didn't just hide it from me. You built a story about us and told other people it was true." Her face did something complicated, a flash of fear, quickly covered by something harder. "You've been going through my email, my files. How long have you been—" "Don't." I didn't raise my voice. "Don't make this about what I found. Make it about what you did." She turned toward the window, arms crossed, and for a moment I thought she'd retreat into silence entirely. Instead, "It's not as bad as you're making it sound. Trevor and I had it structured, so the risk was manageable. This isn't a betrayal, it's a business decision you didn't need to be involved in. A business decision, with my dead father's money, with a man you've been hiding office visits and dinner meetings and God knows what else with for a year." I opened the folder, laid Trevor's email on top, the subject line facing her. "Read it." She read it. Her composure, which had been holding by threads for the past 2 minutes, finally gave. "It's not what it looks like." She started again, and then stopped herself mid-sentence, hearing, apparently, how small that sentence sounded against everything already on the table. Her shoulders dropped. Something in her face changed, the fight going out of it all at once. "Fine." Her voice was quieter now, stripped of the rehearsed defense. "You want the whole thing? I'll give you the whole thing." She finally spoke. This is what she told me, almost without stopping, like something she'd been carrying so long it came out in one unbroken breath. "It started small. A duplex, my own money from the first flip, nothing that touched us. Then Trevor showed me what real capital could do. Commercial properties, real returns, the kind of money that meant I'd never again have to ask anyone for anything. I told myself moving some of the inheritance in was temporary, that I'd put it back before you ever needed to know it had moved. That was the first lie I told myself, and I believed it completely in the moment I told it. After that, it got easier every time. I told myself you'd never even check that account, and I was right, which somehow made it worse instead of better. Like you were handing me permission just by trusting me. I built the LLC structure with Trevor because it was smart and because some part of me wanted an exit that was entirely mine, something no one could take away, the way things got taken away from my mother. I was so afraid of you finding out that I started rehearsing explanations in the shower, in the car, lying awake next to you, running through what I'd say if this exact morning ever came. I couldn't look at Lily's school photos on the fridge some days, knowing what I'd risked to build something she'd never even know existed. There was a night, maybe 2 months ago, when I almost told you everything. I had the words in my mouth at dinner, and then you asked about the gutters, and the moment just closed over, like it had never opened. I told myself I'd tell you once the second property closed. I kept finding a next milestone to hide behind. I never stopped being afraid, Michael. I just got good at not showing it. She was crying by the end, not performing, simply emptied out. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt, because some part of me needed the whole shape of it at once. The way you need to see the entire crack in a foundation before you understand exactly how much of the structure is compromised. "So what now?" she said, when she'd stopped. "Now I go pick up Lily." I close the folder. "And you call Trevor and tell him whatever you need to tell him, because I've already spoken to my attorney, and Monday morning she's filing to freeze every account with your name on it, Meridian included." "Michael, you didn't lose me today, Rachel." I stood, folder under my arm. "You lost me the day you decided I was someone you could build an entire second life around, instead of someone you could just talk to. Today's just the part where I finally stopped pretending I didn't already know." The filing moved faster than either of us expected. Denise had already prepared most of it in advance, and the freeze order went through Monday morning before Rachel or Trevor could move another dollar. Discovery turned up what I'd already suspected, that 11 months of transfers had left almost the entirety of my father's inheritance tied up in Meridian, and that the LLC's paperwork, examined by a forensic accountant, showed Rachel had signed documents establishing herself as sole controlling member on the properties, cutting Trevor's stated share down to a minority interest he apparently hadn't fully understood he'd agreed to. That detail mattered more than I expected it to. Trevor hadn't been the architect of any of it. He'd been useful to her. Capital connections, an office, a convenient story to tell. And once the accounts froze and the properties came under legal scrutiny, he pulled out of Meridian within 3 weeks, citing irreconcilable differences in management, which was, I gathered from Denise, about as close as a business partner gets to publicly admitting he'd been used. Looking back, I understand that was Rachel's real reckoning, not the divorce itself, not even the money. It was watching the one person she'd built her secret independence around walk away, the moment that independence became a liability instead of an asset. She'd spent her whole life terrified of needing someone else to feel safe. In the end, the safety she'd built collapsed the moment it required someone else to stay. The divorce took 8 months. Given the documented misuse of inherited funds a forensic accountant could trace, dollar for dollar, from my father's estate into an account I'd never consented to, the court's division of assets favored me almost entirely. I kept the house. I kept what remained of the inheritance, recovered through the frozen accounts, and a settlement Rachel had little leverage left to fight. Rachel kept her half of the duplexes, her name on a business registry that no longer meant what it once had, and a legal record that would follow her through every future lending application for years. I took Lily most weeks. Rachel agreed to that without much resistance. I think some part of her understood how much ground she'd already lost and didn't have the strength left to fight for more than she could reasonably expect to win. There was one afternoon, a few months after everything settled, when I drove past the Meridian building on the river and saw a different name stenciled on the glass where hers used to be. I sat in the car for a minute, engine idling, and felt nothing sharp at all. Just a quiet, settled kind of closure. The sense of a door that had finally finished closing, rather than one still swinging on its hinge. I started sleeping through the night again that winter. I'd forgotten what that felt like. Waking without the low, wordless dread that used to sit in my chest before my eyes were even open. Lily asked me once, watching me pay bills at the kitchen table, why I checked the accounts so often now. I told her it was just something grown-ups do sometimes to take care of things. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her homework. And I understood, watching her, that this was one lesson I'd make sure she never had to learn the hard way I had. I could have stayed angry. For a while, I did. But somewhere in that 8 months of paperwork and quiet Saturdays without her, I noticed the anger had thinned out into something closer to relief, and I chose to let it stay that way instead of feeding it back to life. That's my story. A browser autofill, a folder in a filing cabinet, an email I was never meant to see. I've had some time to sit with it since, and a few things stayed with me. I learned that trust without attention isn't really trust. It's just a door left unlocked and hoped for the best. There was the porch too. All those calls with the door closed that taught me small inconsistencies are rarely as small as they look in the moment you notice them. And underneath all of it, I understood something about myself I hadn't expected to learn at 44. That the man who avoids hard conversations for 12 years can, when it finally matters enough, become someone else entirely. Someone steadier. Someone who doesn't wait for the truth to become convenient before he's willing to face it. Have you ever found something you weren't looking for? One small detail, an auto-filled page, an open laptop, that ended up telling you more than you ever wanted to know. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If any part of it found something familiar in your own life, I'd genuinely like to hear it in the comments. I read every one. See you in the next story.